What's going on, everybody? Cleopus Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the T-Mobile Revvl 6 5G and going over everything you need to know about this phone to help you decide whether or not it's the right one for you. Now, as always, if you do end up wanting to learn more about it, including information about pricing, availability, and some of the best accessories for it, definitely check out the various links in the video description. But otherwise, let's get into it. So with the T-Mobile Revvl 6, we're getting a 6.52-inch IPS LCD display with a 720p resolution, a PPI of 269, and a 20:9 aspect ratio. So in general, for more of an entry-level phone, this display, while definitely not being bad, is pretty much average. At 6.5 inches, it's not small, but it's also not the largest display out there. But it's definitely big enough to give you a decent experience when you're doing stuff like reading, for example, maybe browsing the web, using social media, stuff like that. And with the 20:9 aspect ratio, we are getting a pretty tall and narrow form factor here. And because of this, when you're doing something in landscape mode, like watching a video, for example, you're going to get a more immersive experience. And things overall are going to look a bit nicer and more cinematic. And then when you're doing things like browsing the web, using social media, stuff like that, with this more tall and narrow shape, you'll be able to fit more content on the screen without having to scroll as much. When it comes to image quality, it's definitely not the best. I mean, with the 720p resolution, things are only going to look so good, but I would say in general for what it is. Again, this is a really entry-level phone. It's at least going to be okay. I mean, if you're watching the occasional video every now and then, it's not like you're going to get a bad experience. But if you are really consuming a lot of content, and that's the main thing you're doing with your phone, like maybe you're watching a lot of movies on various streaming platforms, stuff like that, in that kind of situation, well, again, it's not going to be bad. I do think just for that specific purpose, you can do a lot better. But for more average daily use, well, again, the display we're getting here overall really isn't anything special. It should at least get the job done. Now for storage, this phone has 64 gigabytes of internal storage. And of course, like pretty much any Android phone, we're also getting microSD card expansion. So 64 gigabytes is definitely at least good, especially considering, like I've been saying, this is a really entry-level phone. And while probably most phones in this price range are going to have the same amount of storage, it's quite a bit better than 32, which maybe a year or two ago, I was still seeing phones around this price range that still only had 32 gigabytes. But luckily in 2023, so far at least, even entry-level phones like this still do have a decent amount of storage. And while if you're more of a power user and you're constantly downloading stuff like apps and games, you're probably going to want to go with something that has 128 for the average user, as long as you're mindful of what you're putting on your phone. With 64 gigabytes, you should at least get by, especially considering, again, this phone does at least have microSD card expansion. So if you have a lot of photos and videos, for example, the microSD card expansion is really going to help out with that. For security features, this phone does have face unlock and a fingerprint scanner right here on the power key. Definitely a good spot for it. And in this day and age, I am glad to see that pretty much every phone has both a fingerprint scanner and face unlock, because really it wasn't too long ago that phones in this price range had either one or the other, or sometimes neither. So having extra options besides a pin to unlock your phone is always a nice thing to see. But let's give the fingerprint scanner a try. There we go, one more time. And there we go. So as you can see, real fast and responsive, no issues at all. Now taking a look at the camera setup here, with the T-Mobile Revvl 6, we got a 5 megapixel front-facing camera. Then on the back, we got a triple camera setup with a 13 megapixel main camera, a 2 megapixel macro camera, and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera. Then for video with this phone, we're getting a max recording quality of 2K in the rear camera and 1080p in the front. So in general, the camera setup is okay. Unfortunately, there's no ultra-wide camera. At least we are getting a macro camera, but at this point in 2023, I feel like pretty much every phone should have an ultra-wide camera. It's such a common, useful feature. So if you are taking a lot of pictures and you want a wider variety of features, because there's no ultra-wide camera, this might not be the best phone for you. In that case, you might want to go with the Revvl 6 Pro instead, which does have an ultra-wide camera. But if you're really just a casual camera user, if you're not really taking a ton of different pictures, maybe you want a couple nice pictures for Instagram, for example, in that kind of situation, while this phone doesn't have a ton of different camera features, at least the photo quality for what it is pretty decent. I mean, compared to a mid-range phone like a Samsung Galaxy A23 5G, for example, it's not going to be quite that good. But still, while this is kind of subjective depending on your standards, in my opinion, for something like Instagram, the photo quality we're getting with this phone is at least decent. And then of course for video, I don't really know how useful 2K is, but especially in such an affordable phone, it's a quality you're not going to see every day. So if you do want to record a video in a resolution slightly above 1080p, then there you go. But in general, the bottom line here is, if you're really into taking pictures, if that's really one of the main things you're doing with your phone, then you're probably going to want to go for something else. But if you're really just taking a few photos and maybe recording a video too every now and then the Revvl 6 will at least get the job done. Now when it comes to RAM and processor, with the T-Mobile Revvl 6, we're getting 4 gigabytes of RAM with the MediaTek Dimensity 700 processor. Now this is definitely not the first phone I've seen this processor in, but I honestly can't really complain here, because for entry-level phones, this processor definitely does get the job done. For more basic activities like web browsing, social media, watching the occasional video every now and then, and really just using the phone more moderately and casually, for that level of activity, I do think this phone is going to be plenty fast enough, and that's really what it's meant for. If you are more of a power user, if you're going to be on your phone all day, especially doing more demanding activities like high performance mobile gaming, in that kind of situation, you're definitely going to want to spend a bit more and get something quite a bit faster. But again, for the more casual, moderate users out there, I do think this phone is going to be perfectly fine, and unless you're doing something really demanding on it, it's not going to feel slow either. Now, I did run a Geekbench 5 benchmark test on this phone, and here are the results I got. So what I recommend doing is running this test on your current phone, and then comparing your results to these, and that's probably going to give you a better idea of where this phone stands performance-wise, because depending on what you're coming from, the performance you get with this phone may or may not actually be an upgrade. If you're coming from a slightly older mid-range phone like, for example, a Motorola Moto G Stylus 5G 2021, in that case, it's probably going to be about the same. But if you're coming from maybe a 4G entry-level phone, then chances are this phone might be a pretty solid upgrade. But again, in general, I feel like for the average user, for more moderate basic activities like web browsing and social media, it will be perfectly fine. But once you get into that more heavy use category and more high performance activities, that's when you're probably going to want to go for something faster. Now for the battery, the T-Mobile Revvl 6 has a 4500 mAh battery that supports 15 watt fast charging, so definitely a pretty good battery here. Sure, it's not quite 5000 mAh, you will need the Revvl 6 Pro for that, but overall I feel like for the average user, as in like for most people, the battery life we get with this phone is going to be perfectly fine. So if battery life is important to you, then I would say overall, the T-Mobile Revvl 6 is going to be a pretty good choice. Now when it comes to charging speeds, with 15 watt fast charging, it's definitely not going to be the best fast charging out there, so definitely don't plug this into like a MacBook charger and expect it to go from 0 to 100 in 20 minutes. That's not going to happen. But that being said, if you're like me and you don't pay that much attention to charging speeds, and you just want your phone to charge decently fast, then keep in mind, the charging speed you get with this phone, while not being super impressive, is still going to be at least decent. Another thing I do want to point out here is that with the T-Mobile Revvl 6, we're not getting wireless charging, and the reason I bring that up is because the T-Mobile Revvl 6 Pro actually does have wireless charging, and despite the two phones looking different for the most part, I can't imagine if you don't see these phones every single day like I do, you still might get them confused. So just keep in mind, the regular T-Mobile Revvl 6 does not have wireless charging, but the Revvl 6 Pro, which is about $50 more, does actually have wireless charging. Now, as far as the software goes, with the T-Mobile Revvl 6 Pro, we are getting Android 12, which is at least decent. Sure, it's not Android 13, but this is a really entry-level carrier-branded phone, so we can only really expect so much. So on one hand, if having the latest version of Android is important to you, then I would definitely not get this phone. But if you want something at least decently newer that runs well, then the software on this phone still is not going to be a problem. Another thing to keep in mind, and this is honestly kind of disappointing, is that with the T-Mobile Revvl 6, we're not getting NFC. So if you like to make contactless mobile payments using tap and pay, keep in mind you can't do that with this phone. This is yet another feature that they reserved for the Revvl 6 Pro, which granted is only $50 more. But honestly, NFC is such a common feature at this point that I feel like in 2023 it should be pretty much standard with any phone. But regardless, keep in mind, if you do like to use tap and pay, then this is not going to be the phone for you. Now, taking a look at the overall design, it has pretty much the generic low-end Android look, slightly thicker bottom bezel, water drop notch front facing camera, really nothing special here. But with this material, I do actually kind of like it. The back has kind of a not frosted, but more like matte material, and the color does look really nice. I also like the power key, really small detail, but it definitely does make at least a bit of a difference. In addition to this, the materials in general feel really good. The build quality is nice, so the phone doesn't feel like it's gonna fall apart or anything, and it does have a decent amount of weight to it. So overall, if you're maybe not looking for something premium per se, but you want to make sure your phone has at least good build quality and decent materials, then I don't think you're gonna be disappointed here. That being said though, one thing I don't really like about this design is that with this phone, unfortunately we're not getting stereo audio. So if you're listening to music, watching videos, stuff like that, sound is only going to come out of the main speaker and not the earpiece. And in my opinion, when phones are like this, it definitely doesn't sound nearly as good. Now, of course, if you use headphones anyway, this is really not going to matter. But I don't know about you, but for me personally, I like to have a phone speaker that's at least decent because sometimes using headphones just isn't convenient. So having that option with a good phone speaker is always nice. But unfortunately, again, this phone doesn't really have the best speaker. So if that is something that's important to you, definitely keep this in mind. But in conclusion, my overall thoughts about the T-Mobile Revvl 6 5G. In general, while in my opinion, this phone does leave a bit to be desired, like for example, not having NFC, in my opinion, that's definitely quite a bit of a drawback, even in this price range. In 2023, again, I feel like every phone should have that. And also considering you could spend $50 more and get the Revvl 6 Pro, which is basically the premium version of this exact same phone, and get not only NFC and wireless charging, but also a slightly larger battery, a better camera in general that also does have an ultra-wide camera, and double the storage. I feel like just because that phone exists, this phone is definitely not nearly as worth it. But that being said, of course, this phone is really so affordable that if you're really just looking for a basic entry-level 5G phone, maybe you're really not going to be doing a whole whole lot with it, and you just need the bare minimum that works, then especially considering, again, we are getting pretty good performance here, this phone does have a decent amount going for it, and if you are just looking for something basic to get the job done, then I do think this phone will still be a pretty good choice. But this concludes my review of the T-Mobile Revvl 6 5G. Again, if you want to learn more about this phone, definitely check out the video description where I will be linking to several other videos about it, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Tech on Twitter and Instagram. And as always, I will see you in the next video.